picture here. Fortunately, most of the time you'll be looking at my PowerPoint screen, which should be clear. I will screen share that now. I'm very happy to join you. I've enjoyed being on with you for the last hour and a half, just dropping in to see what it could be like in Arkansas Presbytery. I'm very impressed with you guys. So thank you, Julie. She explained what New Matrix is about. I'm going to run through some PowerPoint slides, and I'm going to warn you ahead of time, you don't need to take notes because New Matrix is entirely an open source organization. So we will send you the link to all the power slides, and you can use them as you will in your own churches. So you can focus and not have to take notes if you are otherwise inclined. I'm very glad to be asked to come into Arkansas Presbytery to work on this with you this morning, and then especially the small group small church vitality workshops that are coming up. So we're going to focus a little bit first, and I'm going to do some talking, and then we're ending with a game that we're going to all play. Good news is you all seem very Zoom adept. So when we get to that, I'll remind you to pop out your chat section if you haven't done that already by then, because you're going to have some interactivity in that game. We're looking at post-pandemic congregational vitality. And I said on the little teaser video that you all had on your website that my epiphany word for this year was the word nimble, and it couldn't have been better matched. That this is an era in which we have to learn how to be nimble with our work into the future. New Matrix has had, in the last few months, as some churches are coming back in person and kind of reconnecting themselves, we've had an awful lot of churches call and say, will you come and lead a 5-year strategic visioning plan with and for us? And we've politely said no, that this is not a time to look out 5 years, because 5 weeks could really be dramatically changing who and what and how we are. But we will teach you to learn how to flex your adaptive muscle. And that's a little bit more like teaching someone how to fish. So that's what we're about this morning. For some of you, I'm sure this will be material you're familiar with. Others, it may be newly articulated. A lot of people think that Darwin's theory of evolution and adaptivity has to do with the strongest surviving. And in fact, that's not what he said at all. He said, it's not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent that survives. It is the one that is most adaptable to change. When I think of that in terms of biological evolution, I think of the giraffe, whose neck grew so they could reach the food they needed. In terms of what adaptive change is and isn't, it's in contrast to what we call technical challenges. A technical problem is something that you know the answer to, or you know who to go to get the answer. Adaptive challenges are problems that you have no idea how to solve. And the illustration that's often used here for that distinction is if you sprain your ankle, that has technical challenges attached to it. If you lose a leg, it has adaptive challenges attached to it. You have to relearn sort of how to walk, things like that. In my household, I've learned how not to try technical challenges that I shouldn't. I know to call the plumber instead of trying myself, things like that. So you know who to go to often in a technical challenge. You know where the expertise is, but in an adaptive challenge, it's a head scratcher. And when you're faced with technical challenges, then it's good that best practices that you look around, they're your friends. How someone else is doing it and it's working well is a good thing to do. But when you're faced with an adaptive challenge, a best practice can be your nemesis and your worst enemy, because what you're aiming for is looking at the one thing that was working before, but the world has changed and it won't be working on the other side of that curve. So we often trip ourselves up by trying to slap a best practice onto an adaptive challenge. Here we are in the midst of our churches. Often we're saying, oh, yes, we want change. We absolutely want change. Who wants to change is a different question. And you'll find that this is true in your own pews. Oftentimes, we fail to acknowledge the fact that change is a grief process. Even if it feels like a really good change. The ministers out there may recognize this from times that they've spent counseling, premarital counseling for weddings that they're going to do. It's the notion that even a wedding, which is a happy event, has change that is a challenging event and can represent a sense of loss and grief. When I grew up in the South, I know I don't sound like it anymore, but I did. And there was often a custom there in weddings that there would be 3 candles up front, a big center candle, and then a bride's candle and a groom's candle, and that were pre-lit. And you would typically have the bride and groom go light the center candle and then snuff out their owns. And it was that snuffing out of their owns that would make me gasp sometimes. And it represented something that I thought, that's a loss right there. That's a sense of grief that is going on, that even in a happy moment. We, in our own churches, when we are looking to ask for change, and we may in our heads understand that we need to move forward with whatever the changes that we're being called to, but in our hearts, it's a little harder to adjust. I worked with 2 churches where we worked over 9 months together on a merger of 2 churches that were actually even very theologically different, both Presbyterian, but they merged. This was in Alabama, and it was a great merger. But I can remember the grief of one member saying, I know it's silly, but we no longer always say the Apostles' Creed in worship. We used to only say the Apostles' Creed in one church, and the others had a pattern of choosing different versions and different sections of statements of faith. And she was in tears, and she said, I cry because I don't get to say that every Sunday. That's just a little illustration. So now let's take a look at what it is in terms of the posture of Christianity in America today briefly. I'm a church historian by training, but I'm not going to give you a lecture on this. The pre-pandemic post-Christendom, I grew up in the South and came to the West Coast for my seminary training. And when I was ordained in 1978, I was already ordained into what we considered post-Christendom here on the West Coast. Christendom was not a majority culture. We were diverse racially, ethnically, certainly in the Bay Area, but also religiously. And so the notion of having grown up in an area of the Bible Belt where even there were still blue laws around that sort of, parted the way on Sunday mornings for us to be the majority culture didn't exist anymore, and hadn't for a number of decades out here. In our post-pandemic understanding of the church, there are a few things that we know so far. I had a call from a church in the Midwest about a month ago saying, we really need your help because we need to fire our pastor. Well, okay, what triggered this? And I was a little leery. And he said, well, we came back to worship and our attendance is down 30%. I couldn't help laughing. And I said, so your solution was to fire the pastor. Okay, let's talk about why and beyond that. And I said, first, I need to congratulate you because the national average of returning to in-person worship is 40% of what was originally there before. And I don't know how you all are experiencing that. We back here are fairly slow to return. If you go into the Central Valley, some of the churches have returned. A lot of them could weather-wise hold worship outside, so they had options now. And now when the Delta hit, they pulled back, and now they're going back. So you may be doing that zigzag yourself, or you may all be back in person. I don't know. But what we are finding is that post-pandemic church looks different, and we don't know yet how it's going to settle out. What we do know is that many of us experienced more people totally sharing worship with us in some format on Sundays than we had before. In some cases, they were probably people, which we adored in a lot of our churches, of people who had been a part of that church family for years and years and then moved away, maybe moved to be closer to the grandchildren. And so they tiptoed back in on an electronic sharing of worship with you. And that was always fun. We've had strangers show up in our church, people that are part of what we'll later be calling the nuns and the duns, who tiptoed in. And remember that, because that represents a lot lower risk factor of experiencing something called worship, that we have generations of people out there that don't understand what that is, haven't experienced that much in their lives. Clearly, some changes that we're going to see are that one big change for me professionally is I will never have to teach another church how to use Zoom. We've been using it for 10 years, and we had to go through that slow process with some stubbornness about, I don't like this stuff, but I will never have to teach that lesson again. The other thing I won't be looked at sidewise for anymore is that I always, about 2/3 of the way through of working with any churches or presbyteries, I would pose the question of, please ask yourselves who you are as a church if you don't have buildings. And in the South, I'd get that that side eye of, yeah, bless your heart, and thinking that I'm that crazy California girl asking a really silly question. But now we've mostly experienced that, a little bit of who we are, asking ourselves who we are without a building. And that's an important part of realigning the lens that we look through in terms of being church. It's not to say that we're advocating selling buildings or getting out of buildings. In some cases, that's exactly what might be called for. But in others, it's a sense of getting away from the bricks and mortar mentality that we've shifted to. Okay. This was my favorite meme of how we've changed during the pandemic. I don't know if you've seen this one. It got to this point where just going to look at and see when are the locusts coming? We didn't know what was going to come next. And that's why we still need to stay in that nimble pattern of our lives. I think one of the things we've learned out here, I don't know if you're experiencing that, but for the nominating committee, I'll say, is it's easier for us, we find, to get people to say, yeah, I'll serve on that Presbytery committee or maybe on your session committees if you'll be by Zoom and I don't have to get in my car and drive anywhere at night and I can just stay home and put my feet up and Zoom in. So that's a boon to some of our nominating committees. I think we will be having those meetings on Zoom more. I think some presbyteries that have for years flown in some of their members because of the geography of their presbyteries, that people had to fly in for their meetings, will look to Zoom as an option. We are all going hybrid in those situations. I know that when I first started talking to Julie, we thought you were going to be partially in person and partially on Zoom for this meeting. So I've had to shift a little bit of how we're going to do the game we're doing, but it's being nimble. Now, here is my come to Jesus quote, as I say, that I got first. I was handed this quote in a conference that I was in. Part of New Matrix and the Presbyterian Foundation were co-sponsoring this. Bill Drummond is the head of urban analytics on the faculty at Georgia Tech. He's also an ordained PCUSA minister and part of the Atlanta Presbytery. So we were asking him, he had just finished a very lengthy and very expensive consultation with the Lutheran Church, the ELCA. And so we typically said, okay, we're going to go on the cheap and say that they're enough like us that we'd like to know a little bit of the bottom line of what you discovered for the Lutherans in terms of what we can expect. He does analytics about, city developments, sort of where to place your bets on where growth will happen and where places will decline or recede or something like that demographically. So this was his bottom line quote to us. He said, if we do nothing different, by 2040, all of our current churches that are sized 100 and less will be gone and will be a denomination of 500,000 people. By the way, when I asked him, he said, I think it's going to be 10 years faster than we thought since the pandemic, that much of a shift. When I was ordained in 1978, we were a 3.3 million church. We're now, I think, a 1.2. And so we've had that 40 years of decline. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. But this is that come to Jesus sense of what will we all be? And we may think, oh, good, phew, I'm not in a church that's 100 or less right now. But we know that similar decline may make you that church over that period of time. So the scriptural image that I use, there are two of them, but the Old Testament one that we use with our work of adaptive challenges for the church is the Exodus story. And what I like about the beginning of the Exodus story is that it really is a journey through the unknown. If you look through the lens of, say, a Myers-Briggs or Enneagram typologies, a lot of us are comfortable with the unknown, but a whole lot more of us are really uncomfortable dwelling for a long period of time in the unknown. And as a matter of fact, in this beginning of the Exodus story is where we trip on the verse that talks about how the people were really irritated with Moses and Aaron. And they said at the very beginning, please, they pleaded with them, please, can't we just go back to Egypt? And you have to remember that going back to Egypt meant going into slavery. So there was that strong pull away from living where you didn't know what things were happening to you one day to the next, to please, I'd rather be a slave. I'd rather go back into captivity. That's a strong pull away from the unknown. And it's especially disconcerting when you notice that when they spell out the timing of that was 6 weeks into what we know now. It was a 40-year journey. So 6 weeks in, they were ready to go back. And when we work on changes that are dramatic within our churches, that same pull is in effect, that please, can we go back? Please, can I live with that idealized version of my church? And as I often say, if we ever get back to, church as it was in the 50s and 60s, man, we've got that down. We know how to do that version of church. And it's just sad that that church isn't what's in front of us. One of my favorite theologians was a woman that we lost a couple of years ago. You probably know of her. Some of you, Phyllis Tickle. She was the most sort of down-to-earth, roll up your sleeves Appalachian woman who was a church historian. And one of her famous stories is about, she says, every 500 years, the Christian church goes through a rummage sale. And I love that image. If you look back at the beginning, the first 500-year mark is when is around the time of when we came under the rule of Constantine, which was when we were first institutionalized. It's when the church was first allowed to own property, when we were first allowed to collect wealth and hold wealth. It was also a time where we first began seriously to think that we needed to part the sheep from the goats in terms of heresy and orthodoxy, that a couple of our biggest confessional statements came out, the Nicene Creed came out of that era, if you will. It became important to say who's in and who's out institutionally at that point. You pop up 500 more years and you get to the split of the Roman Church and the Greek and Russian churches. So we have those two avenues of orthodoxy and two strains of popes that started at that point during the Great Schism. Pop up another 500 years, and of course you get Martin Luther tacking the 95 Theses on the Wittenberg door, and starting a movement that he never would have known was going to be the Protestant Reformation at the time. You pop up another 504 years and you get to today. So we are in that transition period already. Who knew it was going to be influenced by a pandemic? Who knew that, way back when that, it's part of it's going to be the internet is going to change how we communicate with each other and how we form our sense of tribal association with each other. But Phyllis knew, and she was telling us to take a look out for the marks of the rummage sale. So here are some of the marks that we can see. The first is all in the family. When I'm with a group in person, I usually ask everybody to raise your hands, but you all can know that how many this is true of. I say, how many of you grew up in the church? Usually the vast majority. How many of you raised your kids in the church? Again, the vast majority. How many of you have adult children who don't go to church? Okay, the hands creep up, a lot of clergy hands too. And then I get to the question that I even heard put to LaWanda today in your wonderful examination of Wanda, which one of your pastors said, okay, so a longtime member comes to you and says, well, their parents are away, the grandparents want to come and say, would you please baptize my grandchildren who are unchurched? And how do you deal with that? And all of us clergy know that does happen a lot. So we have that all says that a sign of the rummage sale of how we are changing is that baton broke at least a generation ago, where our kids that we raised in the church left for, after high school, going to college. And we all thought, yeah, they'll come back when they get married or have kids. They aren't coming back. So that's that break. Religion in America. I'm sure most of you probably know what the word nuns means. It's the people who check none of the above in terms of religious institutional affiliation on whether it's a Gallup or a Pew poll or any other poll like that. The duns are the people that we now call people who were part of the church, but they're done with us. They could be done with us because they're part of that adult children thing where they broke the baton. They might be done with us because they were injured by the church or rejected by the church. The saddest one I've seen of any surveys, and Barna Group has done some of these surveys, is people who say, I left the church because it was destroying my sense of faith. And I thought, wow, that kind of injury stings. So the largest growing population in America in terms of faith is the nuns. They have tipped over the 50% mark in America now. The growth of the non-joiner generations. So as our younger generations are getting older, they are non-joiners. The first sign of that as a boomer that I recall is when I suddenly didn't have to make a 2-year commitment for a cell phone. The younger generations wouldn't put up with it. So the rule changed. We boomers were like that too. We were the monolith that went through, and rules changed because we were such a huge part of the population that the world adjusted to us. And now we're adjusting to that movement in younger generations. Another sign of it is clearly that people are cutting their cable cords in terms of how they receive their entertainment, their television, and when and where and how they experience that. In terms of non-joining, it's not just non-joining churches, civic organizations, Rotaries and Lions Clubs and AAUW and all kinds of organizations like that are finding that people are not joiners in those lower generations. Christianity is a brand. This is a tough one. It's the man on the street sort of thing can go out and say, what do you think of the word Christian? And they'll get a lot of negative from the nuns, especially negative adjectives, hypocritical, intolerant, judgmental are mixed in. If you ask them, what do you think of Jesus? They get, oh, revolutionary, all loving. And so we are that split sense in terms of being a brand in people's minds of what they would expect. And that'll play a role a little later when I'm talking about some of the signs for us in terms of new vitality. And then this stat is old, 22 churches closing a day. This is a 2-year-old stat. I'm really eager to hear what the stats are in another year or so after the pandemic to see what the pattern is there too. The final one is that being Sunday centric. The head of the NFL boasted a few years ago that the NFL owns Sunday mornings, or owns Sunday, I guess, in America, he said. And the East Coasters, you're in Central Time, the East Coasters then say, well, at least they wait till after church to start the football games. And we West Coasters say, yeah, kickoff, 10 a.m., first round. So again, you go back to that era where I grew up with blue laws that parted their ways for, we will make that Sunday morning thing sacred for you guys. All those sorts of things. I ask in different parts of the country, what were the first signs that we no longer controlled and had a monopoly on Sunday mornings? And in California, it was that youth soccer games started being played, not just practiced, but played on Sundays. When I was in Tennessee, they said NASCAR races on Sundays now. So wherever you are, it may be a little different, but where I am, a good exercise to do is to go out sometime and walk around during your church service. Go walk around where your church is, if it's in an area that's busy enough, and see what everybody else is doing. One of the things that I heard most often, people said they saw families in good weather, families in the park playing, families, all together. And a lot of us have a pattern of the families do their chores on Saturday and enjoy each other on Sunday. Whereas someone put it, they're having Sabbath. Isn't that sad that we consider they're having Sabbath that way as being removed from the church? So a post-World War II model that we have is this split vision of the church. When I talked about can you visualize your church without a building, that comes to this in some regards. That it used to be in the South anyway, you'd ask what church were you a part of? You'd hear about the people. You wouldn't hear about the address and the bricks and mortar. Now we have a habit of seeing church as a consumer experience, that church gives us all our goodies, our religious goods and services, that we go there to be fed and to have our needs met. It's my choir, it's my Bible study, this is feeding me. Nothing wrong with that, but as the primary focus, that skews our understanding of who we are as a church. And then, of course, the missional church is the church that you see as it exists 7 days a week out there in the field, and we come together to plug in and renourish ourselves, and so that we can learn and have fellowship and then go back out into the week. So going to church and being the church have a distinctive difference in us. And this was really a post-World War II phenomenon as a lot of our suburban churches were being built for the first time. And so we understand that we're not going to change the world by going to church. We change the world by being the church. And I loved hearing a lot of the ministries that you guys are already involved in. And I'm guessing I'm going to bring a couple of presbyteries to talk to you about your Ferncliff ministry with the backpacks. I would love to see that grow and see if you want outside participants in that. So here we are, as the concentric circles. That part of our understanding is, how do we reach the unchurched, the nuns and the duns? How do we create a way for them to be a part of who we are, or share our gospel with them? In many cases, we have taken to the attitude: if we build it, they will come. If we build it physically, if we create the program, they'll show up for it. It's sort of a come hither to us, come and find us sort of attitude. And that's not likely in most cases. That if you can imagine people who haven't experienced worship before, it takes a lot to expect that they might get up on a Sunday morning, not know what to wear, not to even know at this point if they're in, if the church is open, or if I had to find them online. But not in the typical days of, if we're in person, not knowing how to dress, walking into a sanctuary that maybe they have been in for a wedding or a funeral, if that, and doing something called worship that they've never really experienced before. That's a hard ask. And so part of what we need to do in terms of vitality is switch our lens to looking at the portals of entry that could be different than Sunday morning for us. Diana Butler Bass famously sort of said, there is an old way of how people used to join a faith community, and there's a new way. And the old path is believe, behave, belong. You pick the people that you shared a belief with and behaved like, and then you could belong to them. And then the new path that we've experienced in post-Christendom is the flip of that: belong, behave, believe. And essentially said you have to be understanding of how you can encourage someone to come and belong with your church family and your worshiping community and your family of faith, without having to run them through the belief gridiron yet, and have them take a look at you and get to know who you are and see if you're a community that they want to attach themselves to, and then do the education and the discipleship through that. And that's a real strong lens change for us. So let's look at the idea of portals of entry that you can consider. As I mentioned, the non-Sunday centric, looking for things that aren't on Sunday as ways of being the church with others. Here's one of the next one is one of the experiments that I like to encourage you to try. Learn what it feels like to be the other. There are two what I call mystery shopper tools that I use a lot and encourage with churches. One is where you go out as a member of your church and talk to two strangers near your church or in the area or something, and say, I belong to this church, and I'd be curious what you know about us or what your impression of us is. It's not a proselytizing meeting. It's trying to get a sense of how people understand you. The most serious one of those that I ever ran into was a church in California where we sent out 7 people asking this. 4 of them came back, and it wasn't the same strangers they talked to, but they got essentially the bottom line of, oh yeah, I know you're that church that chews up its ministers and spits them out. Oh boy, do you have some work to do in that church, if that's the word on the street. And frankly, it was true of that church. The other tool of mystery shoppers is for you to have a couple of your members go to, if there's a Mormon church in town, if there's a Jehovah's Witness church in town, if there's a Jewish synagogue you could pick out to go to, or a Buddhist temple or something, go experience being the other religiously and see what it feels like. Take in what it feels like to be the other in that community. Then you'll get an understanding of what it's like for the nuns and the duns in terms of the feelings that they experience of walking into that. The Theology Pub and Panera with the Pastor, these are ideas of ways to connect with people who are unchurched, that are a low threat and risk level. And these two in particular, I don't know why they popped up, but I don't know if you are familiar with Theology Pub. It tends to be tied to the old C.S. Lewis and Tolkien imagery of them in their local Oxford pub. And the idea of going to and finding this place where then there becomes discussions that in their case was usually about theology, but it can be as deep as you want. I had a church in Georgia tell me, we've got that pub part down. It's the theology part we're still working on. as a group, but that would be a weekly or every 2 weeks kind of meeting. And the Panera one, I don't know why Panera was the choice, but there seem to be a whole lot of examples of using Panera for this. In part, they're very cool with you're taking like a back couple of tables and hanging out there in most Paneras. And that's just sort of the pastor says, I'm going to do Tuesday lunches at Panera, come and join me. And in both these cases, it's a great opportunity for people that are a part of your church to invite either a coworker or a neighbor or whatever else to casually come and join you for that. And there's no threat level. There's no agenda to it. It's a come and see if it feels like we're part of a community that you feel comfortable with. Increasing your civic presence. This used to be a given, that there would be a sense of your church being represented with a high visibility in your community, but that's not a given anymore. So I'm reminding people to look for the ability to find those ways to be part of a civic presence, whether it's your pastor being in the Rotary Club or elders or members of the church sponsoring, being part of a city cleanup day and having a presence in that, or through a parade that's happening in your church. Now, the truth of the 86%, here's a killer. We often have people saying, well, our preacher's not bringing enough new people in. Okay, here's the truth. 86% of the people who come to a church come because a friend who's a member asked them. Only 4% come because of the pastor alone. The other 10%, maybe 2% are because of your social media and advertising presence. And the other 8 are self-initiated. They were church shopping, so to speak. So look at that 86 and say, if we're having trouble wondering about why we aren't growing, let's look at that and see what are we doing and how do we train ourselves to feel comfortable in that kind of invitational period. We know that we need to redefine, got a little technical on my clicks there. We know that we need to redefine membership. I'm sure many of you in your churches have a cadre of people that you consider part of your church family who never have joined the church and who maybe never will join the church. Maybe they grew up in a tradition that they want to keep in their family that's different from Presbyterian, or for whatever reasons. But we used to define membership and engagement levels of churches. We used to measure it. We still measure it, just don't know if we really believe in it, by having head counts on Sundays and sending them to the stats at Louisville. We all know that's not a real good reflection of the engagement levels of our church. And by the way, it's a harder thing to grab hold of in a hybrid worship era too. So understanding what membership means and how you define those who are part of us. And then again, just the idea of looking outward as opposed to inward is critical. In terms of looking outward, here's a baseball diamond illustration that I've put together, my understanding of missional engagement. And to me, there are 4 levels, and all of them are good. There's no bad way of doing mission in this regard, but you need to be honest about the level of depth and interaction that you're looking for from your missional thing. So something we do for them, the backpack ministry, a food pantry, a soup kitchen, those kinds of ideas are all great forms of missional ministries where we are doing something for them. We look at them as saying they need this from us. Second base to me is you do something with them. That could be sharing a project that you're doing with some people who are new to your area. I'm working now with a church in Carmichael, California, that has 1,500 new apartment units have gone in across the double wide street where they're located. And it's mostly Hispanics, and it's an Anglo church. And so we're trying to get them to stretch their understanding of their relationship to that new population, doing something with them, not just viewing them as something that we do for them. The third one is invite them beside yourselves. So one of the ways that often illustrates itself in a church setting is when you let them use your facilities for particular things, whether it's programs or meetings or even nesting worshiping community, but it's still a segregated sense of, it's us and them. And home plate is when the we and the them becomes the us. It says this population of people that we are getting to know and that we are serving in missionally may become who we are in the future. And that is, some churches never make it to that point. That becomes a scary part for them. But those are sort of levels of mission to look at. Okay, now we're going to move into a game. that I had, and we're starting it with this wonderful quote, especially true when I referred back to the time that we're being asked to do in terms of 5-year strategic plans. Peter Drucker, the famous organizing author, wrote, "Culture eats strategy for breakfast." So the first big step is for you to really go deeply into with your congregations and do, what is our culture? Because we all know about those instances where churches work against their natural DNA. One of the most obvious ones is when we have a sense of a magic bullet that is going to turn a church around. And so you see churches, well, probably if we switch to a praise band, that'll do it. Probably if we get a young minister with young children, we'll have a youth group. Those poor PKs. The notion of what culture is natural to your DNA is what's going to work. We've seen too many people fail at a mismatch of trying to use a magic bullet here, or trying a strategy that's just not going to fit because it's not something they're owning. So as we look at that, the game that I developed about 30 years ago, used a lot in my corporate chaplaincy work, is called Animal Farm. And I find it's a lightweight assessment tool, but more than that, it's a game of truth telling. It's like when I say to churches, if you do this in your session, it's bringing the parking lot truth inside. We all know what that parking lot truth is about after a meeting. And it's a fun and way to do it that peels the layers of the onion down of who we are and what we think of ourselves, that's less threatening and non-judgmental. So what I'd like you to do is, we're going to finish it up in these 20 minutes we have left, is pull out the chat feature so that you can follow in the chat. And I'm at a disadvantage here because while I'm screen sharing, I can't watch the chat at the same time. I'm on a single screen, but I'm going to ask Julie to sort of keep a look at the chat, and we're going through 7 different animals. And you'll see when I get to the first one what I mean. There'll be a picture of an animal and a question related to the animal. And what I want all of you to do is go to your chat and write the name of the animal so we can keep them straight. So like the first one's going to be a peacock. You'll type in peacock, and then you'll put your answer or answers to the question there. So it'll be a running chat of all of us going in and sharing with everyone. Think about, in answering these, think about your own church family. For if we have clergy that are unattached to parish ministry, think of a parish you attach your mind to, or a group. Maybe in a nonprofit ministry, attach it to that and think it through that lens. And so we will start. And after I get through all of them, I'll give you a minute or two on each one, but try to keep up. And then when we get to the end, we'll start taking a look at what some of your answers are. Okay, our first one, the peacock. What about your church makes you proud as a peacock? So type the word peacock quickly into the chat and then put down anything, or it could be a number of things, just phrases or words or something that makes you proud as a peacock.
You're getting peacocks.
Good. Good. This is we start with the easy animals. Trust me.
Oh, you've got lots of peacocks.
Yeah, good. We got some upbeat answers. That's good. Okay. When I see the clock tick over, I'll go to the next one. And like I said, we'll share these slides with you. This is often a very good tool to use with your session. And I especially encourage you, if you have youth groups. I had a minister once confess to me, he said, oh, I came in and it was Sunday night and I hadn't planned anything for the high schoolers that were gathering. And so I saw my Animal Farm's pictures. And so I grabbed them. I thought I'd do it with them. He said, best lesson I ever got in ministry was the answers you got from the youth were completely different from the ones you got from the adults in the church. All right, we're going to skip to the second one. Sacred cow, or some people call it the golden calf, but the sacred cow is, what do we treat as that you can't be messed with in our church? Now, this can have a positive or a negative. I'm not judging whether you're putting a sacred cow that, yes, don't ever touch that. Leave that the same always. Or if we're saying to you, man, that's a third rail. It'll burn. It'll crush you if you try that. And I will tell you, one of the most common ones I get is the church kitchen. It's like, don't go there unless you're allowed to go there and deal with them. So put in sacred cow or just cow, and then let me know what in your church is that thing that you know. Don't mess with this. Just don't mess with it. It'll be a big bunch of trouble if you mess with this.
They have lots of cows.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Again, you're telling us and telling each other what your own DNA is here. All right, I'll give it another minute. I'm eager to go back and read your chat at some point and see what all we've got in there. And you're going to learn from each other too. It's fun to do this about your presbytery. If your presbytery gets to a point where it's going through a visioning process for yourselves as a body, I've done this with a lot of presbyteries too. You just switch your focus to the presbytery. All right, you ready? Here's the next one. Of course, the elephant in the room. What issues need to be acknowledged and discussed that we're afraid to tackle? You all know it's the elephant in the room. I know we can populate this one.
Elephants are coming now.
Yeah. They are a big presence, shall we say.
Oh, yeah. Very interesting.
I've used this with nonprofit boards, and actually I have a lot of elders that have done this process with me and said, can I take that to my business and use it? And I said, yep, it's good there too. That's where it started, is when I was a corporate chaplain, dealing with mostly startup organizations out here in Silicon Valley who didn't have a sense of themselves yet. Okay, the next one needs a little explanation. We're the dinosaur. And no, I'm not the type who thinks the dinosaurs were running around with the elephants and the peacocks. I'm not that creationist, but it's a helpful one. What is extinct or needs to die in order for us to move forward? This is a tough one. What do we need to sort of, as I say, bless it and bury it? It could be a program in your church. It could be a way of doing something in your church. And you're just like, I'm so over that. It's especially fun when one person's dinosaur is another person's sacred cow. That often emerges.
Oh, the dinosaurs are coming now.
Yeah. As I say, these can be programs, they can be ways of doing stuff, how we are together. It can be all kinds of things. Okay, here I'm going to the next one. How many of you know the movie Up? My favorite character in the movie is the dog who wears the cone of shame. And in that movie, he doesn't have a real long sense of focus. And so the squirrel, what everything is sort of, he's talking or somebody's talking, and then squirrel, and he turns his head and he's like all over the squirrel. What distractions are keeping us from our task? We've gotten to the point out here of churches and presbyteries that have used this, that now they name this in a presbytery or in a session meeting. It's like, okay, that's a squirrel. That's a squirrel. And it's just, we're using that as the excuse to distract ourselves from what we need to be looking at. You're getting amused already with these, huh?
Yes.
They are fun. They are fun. I can't wait for you guys to start sharing them with me. All right. Give this one another part of a minute and then I'll move on. Oh, I see that now. I've opened it on top of mine and I can see them coming through. Oh, Lord, yes. I'm agreeing with a lot of your squirrels. Yeah. Okay, now here's my next one. It's a little harsh. Roadkill. Yeah, that's like a raccoon or something. I'm not sure. A squirrel, maybe. No, it's got a tail like that. So a harsh picture, but it's naming and embracing our epic failures. This is so important. When I worked as a chaplain in Silicon Valley, an early consult that I had was working for a very small company you probably heard of called Google. It was small at the time. And the notion that I had, why they brought me on and what I was doing with them. And most of these companies brought me on because they believed at their base that spirituality and creativity, or spirituality and innovation, are closely linked. So I would go in leading with that. I think Judy was the one who said she's doing a workshop on this. I led with the fact that imagination is the image of God in us, and whatever your tradition. And so was saying we need to trigger that imagination. But part of that is that in Google, they had hired the brightest and the best of the engineers that were out there. And they were doing things I'd never heard of before yet. And like I can remember the time when I had to say, okay, what is a CD-ROM? It was that long ago. But we said, you've got people who have engineers who have spent their whole life hiding every mistake they ever made. Doesn't show up on their transcript, doesn't show up in an interview, doesn't show up. Social media didn't even exist at the time I was doing this yet. They were creating social media. But they had tried to hide every mistake they ever made. And we recognize that the road to innovation and the road to adaptive change is built on failures. It's that old Ben Franklin, how many times you had to fail before you can get to electricity. And you need to learn to what is now called in the industry rapid failure and quick response. It's sort of, you do your research and development has to have a rapid failure to it. So that we used to change the incentive of the Google people that they would get incentivized towards naming their failures. And that's an important piece for us in moving forward. We're built on grace. Grace is there because of failure. Okay. All right. And moving on to the next one. The nest eggs. This is the future looking forward. What new things are you hoping for in your post-pandemic church? What hasn't cracked open or hadn't taken birth yet? You guys are generating a lot of great responses. A lot of good imagination. Okay, continue populating. But what I'd like to do now, and I'm going to need either Julie's help or someone else's to invite you, because I can't do it, to take you off mute and just weigh in here and tell me either the ones that you posted or that you saw posted that particularly jump off the page to you as being exciting or very telling and very, part of the truth telling of your church or another church that's posted this. So let's go back to the peacock for a minute. What are some things that jumped off the page to anyone?
And just to keep everybody from talking over one another, I think we'll go back to our hand raising and we'll raise your hand and I'll ask you to unmute. That'll just keep us from.
We are decent and in order. That's good.
That's
right. Zoom was made for us.
That's right. So if you want to speak to a peacock. Or maybe you can just unmute and speak, and maybe we'll go back to that if we do talk.
Because maybe we're not all rushing to the mic at this point. So
right.
Go ahead.
Like, go ahead and unmute if you'd like to say something. And if it gets too crazy, we'll do it. Karen did raise her hand, so let's start there. Maybe that was a mistake.
Karen was muted. She was talking, but we
I
can't.
wasn't unmuted.
There you go.
I just wanted to say that the chat went so fast that it was hard for me to notice or remember what comments were made under Peacock and Dinosaur and all the other issues. So it's hard for me to respond just because I don't remember what they are anymore.
You can scroll back up if you want to. I just scrolled back to that area of the Peacock. If that logistically is beyond you, then the good news is that when you save a recording, and this is being recorded, you save the chat too. So if you ever spend time chatting and saying things you think are going to be a secret to someone, know that the chat gets saved, and that can be shared. But you can capture it, which is a good thing.
Go ahead, Rebecca. Unmute.
Sorry, yeah, I had to unmute myself. I am really proud of the ways that we've stepped out and ahead in social situations, that we're not behind the curve, we're almost ahead of the curve, whether it's our response to the school shootings, with things that Ferncliff has done, First Church Conway, having Conway Cradle Care for mothers that are pregnant in high school, the ways that Presbytery supports Wellspring Renewal Center to provide mental health counseling free of charge, confidential, private for pastors. Anything that we do, we're just actively responding. We're courageous, fearless, and we just jump out and do what we feel convicted to do, led to do.
What a great muscle that is. That is that quick adaptive response of risk taking. It for churches to have risk muscles is so important because so many of them are risk averse. So many of us are risk averse, and to be able to say, "Let's try this. An experiment" is the notion. Don't ever start the first annual anything. Experiment, being willing to have that dinosaur pop up, but try it and go for it. Good. Anybody else on the Peacock before I move us on?
Stephen.
Yeah, the Presbytery 2 years in a row gave us funding to renovate a house that the church owns, and we did, and that created seed money for more people to invest in renovating that house. And tomorrow we're going to have our open house for the first, I believe, in Arkansas, permanent venue for LGBTQ youth programming. And we found a volunteer director that's outstanding, and he's been able to network with other people. And it's just amazing. So kudos to the Presbytery for believing in that vision and helping us get it launched. Amen.
And kudos to you all for saying this is our true DNA. And in terms of the Christian brand, this is who we are. I'm going to move us on and say, okay, let's look at the next, the sacred cow. What are some sacred cows you guys live with, good or bad?
Anybody want to unmute or raise your hand to be recognized? All right, Becky, go ahead.
Okay, it's interesting that I listed this as both a sacred cow and a nest egg. But Becky Purcell, targeted transitional pastor at Mount Comfort in Fayetteville. The first, as any member would be quick to tell you, the longest continuously operating Presbyterian congregation west of the Mississippi. So the sacred cow and nest egg is this church's rich history.
Okay. I see a lot of styles of worship and orders of worship is like, don't touch that stuff. Even one had where the chairs are placed. Yeah. So that's a lot of sacred cowness too. And that style of worship, because we're struggling with that in a lot of places. You know, I can't tell you how many churches I've worked with that have switched to a praise band, but they are paying, one was paying $6,000 a year to store their organ. And I said, it's like, really, you think that you're gonna bring that organ back? Well, someone will want it. And I said, you have no idea how many people don't want your organ. And to the point where it's become avant-garde out here where I live, where old organ pipes will sell and they'll put them as sculptures in people's gardens. But not a whole lot of people want your old organ. So. Is there another one on sacred cows?
Barbara, you can unmute and go ahead.
I think our sacred cow is our building because we've had a lot of vandalism this past year, like 5 times the vandalism.
Oh.
And we've just been so upset with, the reason why, because we try to help the community so much. And then this is kind of like, our repayment for, kind of like a non-repayment for what we've done for the community. So I think ours is just our building.
Wow. It's a tough story. All right. I'm going to move on to the elephant in the room. Oh yeah. I know you've got a good imagination on the elephant and experience on elephants in your room. Who's got something to share?
Carol, go ahead and unmute.
Yes, this isn't specific to a church, but I think if we really took seriously how much of our time and energy is actually spent on physical stuff at the church, that we might be really surprised.
Yep, I do an exercise of a budget pie chart. I ask for the church's budget and then I show it back to them. I have them on a budget game, and I'll send you this material too. I do 2 empty pie charts and say, in the first one, write what, color in what you think the percentages are. The pie chart breaks out on certain things like worship or building or personnel and stuff like that. And then on the other one, do what you think would be ideal. And then I put the reality in front of them, and it's a come to Jesus moment for a lot of them.
One of the things is that I wonder if we really, like you said, looked at the budget and said, if somebody didn't know us and looked at our budget, what would they think our priorities are?
Your budget is your mission statement, frankly. Yeah. Okay. Let's go on from the elephant. I need to rush us through. What did I have after that? I can't remember what my animal is. Oh, it's the dinosaur. Okay. What dinosaurs? What do we need to bless and bury? Some of the committees, that's an important one. I've run into tiny little churches that still have like 15 elders and maybe 30 members. I said, seriously? You need to look at that. You're burning your people out.
All right, we have a hand raised on that one. Bradley?
Okay.
And I completely forgot what I was going to say. So that doesn't help.
No other hands raised right now.
Okay, I'll move on. Some of you may learn from each other's dinosaurs. Say, oh yeah, that's true here too, that I hadn't thought of it. Squirrels. Oh, we're good at distracting ourselves.
We have Marie, go ahead.
I was raising my hand for dinosaurs, and I was going to say membership models and who counts as a member and who doesn't.
Yeah, exactly. We need to figure that out somehow differently.
Adam?
Hi, I had mine raised for, this is kind of a dinosaur and an elephant. Doing everything in only English. We have a lot of neighbors that live right next door to the church, that maybe don't speak English. And I think that it can be done.
All right.
Okay, I'm going to step down and do the biggie. And this one is the roadkill. Again, who has something that was a failure you needed to name in your church? And these are often ones that we don't speak out loud. It can be a program that bombed. It can be picking the wrong pastor. It can be, outspending your means, whatever it is.
Brad, go ahead.
Bringing in a new pastor without first healing from the damage caused by the previous pastor.
Bingo. Okay, I'll go on to our nest eggs. What are you hoping for in terms of a rebirth or a new birth in your church?
iPhone can go ahead. Who has your hand raised? I'm not sure who it is. Go ahead.
Is that me?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry about that. I think my own view of this is I think the pandemic has been a huge gift to the church. We have an opportunity now to do almost any change that we have the vision to apply, because we have radically changed how we do things just by the use of technology. And you can probably do all kinds of things differently, and the congregation will be open to it, because what we are doing now, at least what our church has done, is so radically different from anything we did before. And it was forced on us by the pandemic. It wasn't something that it's something we could have been doing all along in terms of the video, sending Facebook, sending out of the worship services and everything. But there are all kinds of things we could do now that we could have, we would have wrung our hands over before. That's just what I see and what I think.
Yeah, that to me is an example of necessity is the mother of invention. It's that notion of when the pandemic hit us, we were smack in the middle of Lent 2 Lents ago. And as I like to joke, I said, every clergy person suddenly turned into a televangelist overnight. And certainly none of us were expecting that to be part of our calls. But what we proved to ourselves is that we have a strong adaptive muscle that we haven't thought of using. And it has broken open a lot of our ways of thinking that we're stuck before. So thrive on that. Use tools like this if it's helpful for thriving on that. I'm 3 or 4 minutes over, so my last slide is just to say that this is a modern version of the journey that we are taking. And I sort of love this cartoon. We're going to be in that wilderness for a while longer, so we can't nail it down. And we have to embrace the recalculating. I thank you, and I look forward to any of the small churches that either are planning to join us or want to. We're going to go many deeper layers into the notion of how some of this applies to your particular circumstances. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Deborah. So engaging and interesting, and a great lead into the sessions that you'll be doing for the Presbytery in the coming months. So thank you very much. I imagine that the participation will go up a lot. Thank you very much.
Yep.
All right, I'm going to stop.